In the previous video, we've created the user model and then we've written a test to make sure that obviously the user model works as expected. Now in this video, we are going to start working on the guard class. Now guard class is going to be used to authenticate the user, to log the user in, log him out, save the Remembe token and so on. So everything that's to do with the authentication is going to be stored within this guard class. We are going to start with going to app, then we're going to go to utilities, and we've got already our guard class here. Now one thing that we need to start with is to create two constants. First constant will be called session name, and it will contain a string which is basically going to define what name our session will have. And I'm going to set it to simply auth. And then we're going to have another constant called Remembe. And this is going to be the name of the cookie that will store the Remembe token. Okay, we can add some doc blocks here. Var that's string. This one is also string. After these tokens, we are going to start with a method that checks whether the user is authenticated. So public function, and we're going to call it is authenticated. And we start with a session variable equals, and then we use session manager that we've written earlier, then method get, and we are going to look for the session with the name associated with this session name constant. So self and then session name. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to check if empty this session, meaning that obviously the session hasn't been set, it's not available. In that case, we're going to return this, and the method which we'll create in just a moment is going to be called is remembered. So if we don't have a session, check if we have Remembe token. So then we can find the user by this token and log him in. Let me just create a few new lines. And after this, we know that obviously there is a session, at which point we simply return hash with the method verify, because we're going to store the session, the ID of the user, and then the hashed version of this ID as well. So we're going to verify it, session ID, and then session hash, just to make sure that they obviously match. Okay, so that's our is authenticated method. Let's just add some doc blocks here. It's going to return boolean true or false, then check if user is logged in. Okay, the next method we're going to be working on is this is remembered. So if we add this method, and we're going to start with if, and then exclamation mark variable token we're going to create, and then straight away associated with this remember token method, which will get us the token, the value associated with the token. If we cannot find this Remembe token, which is going to be stored within the cookie, then we return false. Now, if you're not familiar with this statement here, this statement isn't quite clear. Basically, we have the exclamation mark obviously checking for negative output, and then we, at the same time as we are checking using this Remembe token method, we associating the value returned from this method to within this variable. So later on we can actually use it if this fails. So let's quickly add this Remembe token before we actually continue with this method. And Remembe token will simply return, and we use this cookie manager this time, get method as well, self, and then Remembe constant. So we're looking for the cookie with this, with whatever is stored within this constant. In our case, is going to be Remembe string. So that's going to return it. If it cannot find the cookie with this name, then obviously this is going to evaluate to true, at which point we're going to return false. Because if we get to this point to call this method, we know already that the session is empty, so there was no session of the logged in user. And obviously if there was no session, then the last thing that we can check is for this Remembe token, which is what we do. And if that fails, then obviously there was definitely no session set for the user at all. Okay, so let's continue with our isRemembered method. After we've checked, and obviously if we get to the point that we, after this if condition, that means that obviously the token has been found. So we're going to set this authenticated equals user by remember token, and we pass this token through. And let's set this authenticated property. I'm going to make it public so we can access it from outside of this class, and that's going to store the instance of the user model. And obviously make sure that you import this user model here, also cookie and session manager. So we are basically trying to find the user by this token. We have this scope by remember token on the user class. If we could just open this, let's check for these scopes here. So we have scope by token, we have scope by remember token. This is where we're using this by remember token. So we are trying to find the user by token. But after this remember by token method, we also need to call first method to get the first record that matches this token. Okay, so now we check if is null this authenticated, then obviously user by this token could not be found, at which point we're going to return false. And then if the user has been found, what we're going to do is to log in this user. So this login, and then we pass this authenticated, and then we return true to indicate that obviously the is authenticated returns boolean. Okay, we don't have this login method, so let's quickly add this method as well. Now login methods, if we just type hint this argument here by user, and then the last argument, because we're going to add another argument here, which is going to be remember set to false by default. So when we actually call it here from within this is remembered, we didn't pass it through, by default it's going to be false. So here, and we need to make this method public because we might want to use it outside of this class as well. So we have this authenticated user. Rather than authenticate, I'm going to just simply call it user as an argument here to this login method. We're going to start with session manager, and we're going to use the set method, self, and then session name, which is going to be the name of the session that we're trying to set now, and then array. The first item will be ID, and it's going to be user ID, and then hash, which is going to be hash make, and then user ID as well. This is why, if I just scroll up here, you can see we are verifying the session ID against a session hash, and this verify method will tell us whether the string matches the hashed version of the same string. Okay, so that's the session that's going to be set when we log in, so that later on when we get to the next page, we know that the session is set and obviously the user is logged in. And then we check if remember, if it's set to true, then we also use static this time method called set remember, and we're going to pass user as argument. Let's quickly add this set remember method as well, and it's going to be private static function. I'm just going to move it down right to the bottom because for some strange reason it just went up to the top of the class. So we have this login and then set remember, user red type hinted with the user class. There we go. And here what we're going to do is, first of all, user, we're going to call method update remember token, and let's quickly have a look at what this method does. So just to remind ourselves, it sets the remember token on this instance of the user class to this hash, basically using this algorithm SHA256, some random string, and then saves it to the database. So basically this remember token will be regenerated if it was already set to something, and then it returns instance of itself. So user update remember token, and then we are going to use cookie manager set, and similar thing as we did with the session. We start with a constant self, and we have this constant of remember me, and then user remember token. We set basically this cookie called remember me to this token which you've just saved with this user, and then date when we want this to expire. I'm going to use carbon here package, and then now, which is current date, and then we want to add year to it because we want this cookie to expire in a year time, and then timestamp property. This is going to return the correct date that we want this cookie to expire. Okay, so that's our set remember private static function, and let's just call it set remember token. And so we are going back to the login. This login method is also completed now, so we can add some doc blocks and authenticate user. Actually, it's not authenticate, log in user. Log in user, log user in, log user in. I think that sounds a little bit better. Okay, another method that we need to have, and I'm going to add it right after this remember token, and actually this remember token needs some doc blocks as well. So returns either string or null if there's no cookie with this name. Get remember me token, and let's just check if we've got no, we haven't got for is remember, we haven't got doc blocks either. It's going to return boolean, so check if user has a cookie set to keep the profile logged in, or to keep him logged in, him, her logged in. And I think that's going to do for this one. Do we have authenticated? Yes, we've got. So after this remember token, we need to provide a means for us to be able to forget the token as well. So private function forget token, and it's going to be cookie manager remove. We don't return anything. This is going to be void function self, and we use this same constant remember me. So this way we'll be able to remove this cookie, and obviously the session, if it was relying on a cookie, will also expire. Okay, remove remember me token and return void. It doesn't return any value. Okay, so forget token. After this, if we scroll down, login, we have set remember method. We also need the method to which will allow us to log out. So let's provide this method. It's going to be public method logout, and then session manager, and we're going to call method remove, and then self and session name. So this is the session that we want to remove, and then we will also call this method which we've just created, this forget token. There we go. And let's add some doc blocks as well. We start with log out user and then return void. It doesn't return any value either. Okay, next method will get us the authenticated user instance. So public function user, and we check if exclamation mark this is authenticated. Obviously we're checking if it's not authenticated because we have this exclamation mark preceding this call to this method. Then we return null. If it was authenticating, then we return, and again another static method which we'll create in just a second. It's going to be called get user. Let's quickly add this method, but before we do this, and again for some strange reason these static methods are going right to the top of the class. Let's just add the doc blocks to this user method. It returns null, or it returns instance of the user, and then we get instance of the authenticated user. And now here, from within this get user method, we are going to check if session manager has, and then self session name. If the session with this name exists, then return user find. And now the ID that we need is going to be stored within the session manager get, and then again self session name. So this is going to give us the session, but this session obviously is of an array type because it's got ID and a hash, and we need to get just the ID, so ID after this get method. Okay, so this is going to return the user only when we have this session, so when the user has logged in and the session is active. Otherwise, we return this authenticated property. Why do we return it? Actually, this shouldn't be static here. It should be just a normal method, not static. This get user, sorry, because obviously we wouldn't be able to call this if it was a static method. Okay, so why do we return value associated with this property? Now have a look at how we went through it, starting from this user method. So first we checked is authenticated, and what happens with this is authenticated method. If we scroll up, is authenticated checks whether the session exists. If it doesn't, it calls this is remembered method. And now this is remembered method, if the token doesn't exist, then straight away returns false. But if it does exist, then it gets user instance and associates it with this authenticated property. This is when we could potentially have the user instance associated with this authenticated. That's why if we don't have a session, then we return value associated with this property. Okay, so let's quickly add some doc blocks here. It returns user and get user instance by session or remember me token. And I think that's it within this class. Let me just quickly check if we haven't missed anything. Log out, set remember, login, forgot token. Yeah, everything seems fine. So let's move to the next video when we are writing a test for this guard class.